Hi friends, strangers, internet. My name is Emily of Imperfectly Em. I love colorful makeup and colorful language. I'm a makeup nerd, and something that I have come to embrace, especially if you look in the last 3 or 4 months, is that I love being a makeup nerd on my channel and talking about textures and finishes and comparing things and talking about color theory and all of it. And I've had this thought in my head for a while now, and here we are finally doing it. I'm talking about all my concealers. I love concealers. Concealers are my favorite base product over foundation or powder or BB creams or anything like that. They're my favorite. They're the thing that I nerd out about in that realm. And I kept thinking about my concealers in comparison to each other in terms of like thickness or thinness, the textures, the finishes. So I'm just gonna nerd out about my concealers. I have quite a few to talk about. I have a lot of drugstore options. I have some mid-range, and I definitely have some luxury. We're gonna do swatches. I'm gonna talk about finishes and how they blend out, how they apply, how I color mix with some of them. We're talking about all of it. If you enjoy nerding out about makeup, if you like colorful makeup, if you like bitches with lots of opinions, or you just like cute fat babes, I would love for you to subscribe. I also have a Patreon and a channel membership that are amazing ways to financially support me, and I always appreciate that. And I don't really know what I'm doing over there, but I love having y'all there. Anyway, let's just get into this video nerding out over all of my concealers. Let's talk concealers. This is my concealer collection. I love concealers. The other day, a while ago actually, I think when I was revisiting the Rose Ink concealer, I started thinking about, like, I'm always thinking about textures and finishes of things, but I was thinking about the texture and finish of the Rose Ink concealer, which I have evolved my thoughts on, compared to like this newer NYX concealer that I love. And most of these in my collection have some level of love or appreciation, but it varies. And I realized that like texture is a big thing for me, and how that interacts with the finish and all of that. So I put together this order, this kind of ranking, not best to worst, but more of like thinnest to thickest. And I'm just gonna go through each one and talk about that. So let's start with the LA Girl Pro Conceal color correctors. I use these mostly as a mixing kind of concealer. Actually, I'm not going to say mostly, because I tend to use the green. Or is this? Yes, this is the green corrector. I use this directly on my skin, and then I will use the light yellow and the mint to mix with concealers that are either too dark or too peach. And I definitely feel like bringing these into my life helped me kind of start considering texture and thinness or thickness. These fall in the thinnest kind of part of my ranking, my standings. And part of that is the packaging. And I've realized that the packaging is a huge part of the concealer experience. So what I'm doing right now is I'm brushing these on without squeezing out any more concealer. And this is often how I am applying it, in that the brush itself helps me use a small amount of product. I don't like this packaging. And I can pump out, squeeze out more to go in with a more intense application, or really like give myself more product to work with, which is helpful, especially when I'm mixing. But the thinness that I'm able to apply with just using the brush has become this huge like boon in my experience or opinion, because I can really work it into the skin in a way that I'm not always able to do with other concealers. Now, with a brush or your fingers or a sponge, a lot of concealers can be worked into the skin, but there's something really nice about just using your brush to do that. And some people might hate this thought because like then it makes the brush even more kind of contaminated because you're working it on your face skin. You know, you might have acne or you might have other concerns with doing that. But for me, I really appreciate that. I feel like it becomes part of your skin in a way that doesn't feel like a lot of additional product. Now, if I work it, or if I use a lot, or if I'm mixing it in, you know, with another concealer, then I do find that the texture becomes a little bit more apparent. It definitely will thin out my other concealers and kind of sheer out their coverage, because this is a thinner formula, and a sheerer formula, I guess is a better way to describe it. But I just really enjoy how I can work it into the skin and it color corrects, and then I can go in with other products and it doesn't feel super heavy on my skin. These have become an absolute staple for me, both in using the green on my skin directly. This is messy. And using these other colors to mix with a lot of the concealers you're going to see today and get a better color match. And I think if these were a thicker formula, I don't think that they would behave in the same way that they do at their current state. The next concealer up is the Kokie Be Bright Concealer in Fair. It looks gross because of moving and packing, but that is life. So this is not my favorite concealer. I picked it up because my dear friend Teresa loves it. But I think because this is not the right tone for me, it was going to be a bit of a hard sell. It's also, in my opinion, a very thin formula. So for me, I think if I was using this more all over the face, I might enjoy it more, but under my eyes, it just doesn't usually give me the oomph that I need. But it does have a nice consistency to it. If they had a color that was more of like a light yellow, then I could see myself using this as a concealer under my eyes, even mixing it with a slightly deeper color. But I have used this on my face as like a color corrector. Actually, around Halloween, sometimes I was mixing these two and getting like a violet tinted base for Ursula and that era of makeup. So I'm using it, but it's just not my favorite. But I think, again, it might be more of a color thing, but I think it has a nice thin consistency that's not too drying or too crinkly. Another thin concealer that I have, this one I have raved about on my channel. This is the Flower Beauty Light Illusion Full Coverage Concealer. This is in light 2.5 vanilla. I feel like this might be one of my best general matches. It's not perfect, but it's one of those that when I'm in my kind of in between, depending on how much sun I'm taking in out of the pool, this works in a lot of different ways. Now, the thing that I have found with this concealer is that I mentioned how like the Kokie is a thin formula, but it doesn't get crinkly under the eyes. I feel like sometimes the Flower concealer does that for me. Sometimes thin formulas, like they just settle in more than a more emollient formula, or they can just accentuate your skin texture more. This doesn't do it so bad that like I don't like it. I just used it again recently and I was reminded like, oh no, this is a nice one. This feels like a no fuss concealer because it generally matches for me and it's a thinner texture. I can use it under the eyes. I can use it all over the face in like a spot coverage, light coverage kind of thing. And I feel like it does, you know, like I said, dry in a little bit of a way that's not always the most complimentary, but in general, I think it does the job. And I think it has quite a nice texture and formula for, you know, this is drugstore adjacent pricing, in my opinion. Now, I thought of the Rare Beauty Concealer and the Flower Beauty Concealer kind of similarly in my head. I feel like this one, and I have this in 170W, this one feels a little bit thicker than the Flower concealer, but it's still on that thinner side. And this is really a very solid color match for me because it's yellow enough. It's light enough that I feel like it does give me brightness, but also coverage. And the only reason why this has kind of fallen out of grace for me over time is this, first of all, I think everything settles into lines. I think that's unavoidable. I am not in the camp of, you know, you can powder set it or whatever to change that. Just depending on your face shape and your lines and all of that, it just happens. But this concealer tends to settle in my lines worse than others in a way that is more noticeable than other concealers to me on my face. There was an ease about this concealer, and hopefully you can see with most of these, like you can see that I've used a lot of these quite a bit. There is an ease about a concealer that works, you know, in terms of like actually kind of matching the tone of my skin, which is a yellowy olive, but also, you know, on the lighter side. And that works under my eyes, but I can also lightly apply and blend out elsewhere. Like I was talking about the Flower Beauty Concealer, I feel like the Rare Beauty Concealer has a sense of like ease to it, but because of the settling that happens, it's fallen out of favor. I do love the doe fit on this though. I really enjoy the slant and the shape. It's not too big and it's not too tiny. But as I was saying, because of the settling situation, I reach for this less over time. Okay, the Dior Forever Skin Correct. Yes, this is definitely a favorite concealer. I have it in 2W Olive, and I really think that the undertone makes such a big difference. Now, as I have complained about another concealer in this roundup, this has gotten messy, and I closed it a couple nights ago without like a little forcefully, and I think it made it worse. But the thing with this, so I do consider this a thinner texture concealer, but it feels like a very natural finish. Slowly close that. It feels thin, but emollient. I consider it a very natural finish that can be applied thinner or in a more built up section. And this olive, now this is definitely a step or two, or maybe three, I don't know, too deep for me. So I would love if they had like a 1.5 warm olive. Oh, that would be perfect. Or maybe a 1. Maybe a 1 mixed with a 2 might get my perfect shade. But with this concealer, if I'm not very poolside tanned, then I will grab my light yellow color corrector and mix it, and I get a pretty amazing color. But there is just something about the olive in this color that makes this such a beautiful tone on my skin. Even if I didn't love the formula as much, I think this one would end up being a winner in my head for the undertone. But the formula is just super beautiful. As I've talked about a lot, I use concealer as like a lightweight base, not applied like you would foundation, but just applied in certain spots and blended out. I think all of the concealers that I have really work for that, but some are like more standout than others, and there's just something about this formula. It's also a pretty giant bottle, so I feel like I feel comfortable using it that way. It's just a really beautiful finish that doesn't, in my experience, get that crinkly effect, but it's also not so emollient or so dense where it becomes a problem in that way. So I just really enjoy the way this concealer applies and kind of exists on my skin. And I understand the luxury hype for this one. I have been raving about the NYX Bare With Me Concealer Serum. I have it in vanilla, and you can see from the container, I have been using it yet again. This one is a beautiful under eye and also facial concealer. The pump is pretty easy to control. This vanilla color is a little bit more pink, but it's still a beautiful face and under eye concealer. And it has, I think serum is a smart way to describe it. There is something about the texture of this concealer compared to like the Flower Beauty or the Rare Beauty. I feel like this keeps that like bouncy, hydrated thing. I find that it's thin, but it's not. It's like very hydrating without being a thicker or more whipped formula. It just has this like nice middle ground texture, kind of in the way that I was talking about the Dior. I would say this keeps more slight emolliency. Like, can you see the subtle kind of glow? Yeah, it's not even subtle under this ring light. It doesn't necessarily stay this dewy all day, but I think that like the way that this looks is a good representation of kind of like how it makes it different. I think it just stays generally very like hydrated looking. It's very light. So like sometimes it's not going to cover, let's say, my under eye darkness as much as I would like it to, but because it generally makes the skin look so nice and like fresh, I'm like okay with, let's say, some darkness shining through, because the general way it makes my skin look is just so lovely. And as somebody that had the NYX Bare With Me skin tint, this is miles better. I felt like the skin tint was too little. It was like too little, not enough happening. Whereas I feel like this is actually a nice balance of coverage and just beautiful skin. I want to talk about these two concealers together because I kind of get them mixed up in my head a little bit in terms of how I feel about each one. So I have the e.l.f. Hydrating Camo Concealer. Hydrating is a very important part to remember. And this is in medium peach. And then I have the ColourPop Pretty Fresh Hyaluronic Creamy Concealer in light 50W. I've had the e.l.f. Hydrating Camo Concealer before, and I basically used up the bottle. The color that I bought the second time was not my best choice. I'm going to be honest. Definitely too deep and too peachy for me. But it was the only, like one of the only colors when I was in Target in the US last year. And so I just went with it. And then this ColourPop shade is similar to the e.l.f. one. This is, like I said, light 50W. It's definitely too dark and it's a little bit too peachy, but you can see it has more yellow in it than the e.l.f. one. I think of these pretty similarly in my head in terms of consistency. Now, the doe foot kind of tells a bit of a different story, and I think that's like a good example of how the packaging can just make a difference. With the e.l.f. one, I do feel like the doe foot kind of picks up a lot more, and really like you get a nice dollop at the end, whereas this flatter ColourPop doe foot, it doesn't like pick it up in that same way. And maybe I would say when I'm looking at them side by side that the ColourPop is probably a little bit thinner than the e.l.f. But both of these do benefit from letting them sit on your skin before blending, because sometimes when things are so emollient in this nice hydrating way, they can like be blended out to nothing. And that's awesome in some capacity, but I find that like when I want coverage, it's nice to let it sit, because then you can get the coverage where you want and then blend it out into the skin elsewhere. Yeah, I would say when I'm touching both of them side by side, the e.l.f. one does feel a little thicker and more emollient, but almost in like a whipped way, in that it still feels less dense. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's like the e.l.f. one feels thicker, like there's a little bit more air, whereas the ColourPop one feels thinner but a little denser, in that like it doesn't blend out into nothing quite as easily as the e.l.f. one does. I think they both have a nice formula though. I have to say, I know that like I have said my piece about ColourPop and I still feel that way, but I think that this is a nice formula, and I think that the e.l.f. one is too. And I have no idea which one has a better or more comprehensive color range, because I obviously struggled anyway. So the next concealer up, I have two colors in. This is the uoma Stay Woke concealer. So I have White Pearl T0.75 and White Pearl T2. I bought these, most of these concealers, a lot of them might be trash worthy, but we're not going to talk about that. I bought both of these in 2020, so I was not going in store, and they weren't in my local Ultas. So the first color that I got, T0.75, or was this? No, I don't think this was the first color, but this one is the lighter of the two, and it's definitely more pink. I think T2 is what I was originally recommended and like and quote unquote match to. And it definitely was too dark for me at the time. So then I ended up buying T.75 thinking I could mix them. And I can mix them, but I will say in reality, T0.75 is more like the kokie one in that it's more like a color corrector under my eye. And then T2 I could put on top and use it on my skin. Now, the way my skin has evolved since then, I can use T2 by itself. I will say, because I've had these for a while, when I first bought this concealer, oh, but you can see it, it's a very whipped formula. And for me personally, this is the first time I had experienced that level of whipped texture. And I think it's harder for me to show you now because I have used a lot of the concealer, but it really, like, the way the e.l.f. one showed up on the doe foot in that like big dollopy way, the uoma one would do that, but in an even more whipped way. And I realize all of these concealer noises are pretty gross. So part of my brain feels like these probably now I would say might be less thick than like the e.l.f., but I think of them as like thicker but whipped. So but these rankings are not the most accurate, but this formula definitely thrives with being left alone for a bit before you blend out, because I have found that when it's super emollient, it really can just like blend into nothing. And by super emollient, I mean when I very first put it on. But the thing with these concealers, I would say the uoma, the e.l.f., and the ColourPop all kind of live in that space for me in my head. that tendency for these concealers to want to blend away into nothing is actually kind of a benefit. It really looks super natural and very seamless on the skin, but if you let it sit, it can have that higher coverage. So I feel like it just makes it that much more versatile versus either a concealer that goes on so thin and can't really be built up, or like the last two I'm going to talk about, concealers that are very high coverage and also very like thick, that can sometimes be a little more challenging. So are these technically at this point in time thicker than these two? I kind of feel like I want to change my ranking and say no, and say that these currently and in their finish are thinner than these two. Now, this beauty does not look so beautiful right now. This is the Pat McGrath Labs concealer, and I think I had like light too vanilla or too warm. Oh, I need to mix you up. You actually also might need to go. Let's see. No, it smells. This concealer has always had like a slightly weird chemically smell to me, and it still has that. So this, in my opinion, is quite a dense concealer. It has a much smaller doe foot, and it doesn't tend to like, no, it does pick up quite a bit of product, but it's less of that like kind of dollopy texture, which is why it's where it is in the ranking. Oh wait, I never cleaned off my hand. Also, does anybody have the experience of like all of their Pat McGrath stuff losing its bottom sticker? Because my lip glosses are doing that too, and it's annoying. So this, in my opinion, is quite a dense concealer. I can definitely diffuse this out and use this all over the face, but no matter what, she's a pretty full coverage baby. And I think it's the more traditional kind of like denser, thicker texture and the way that texture blends out that she feels more full coverage and she feels more of like a full glam concealer. Now, this reminds me of how I talked about the Tarte Shape Tape for a long time. I loved that concealer actually. And a lot of people were like, oh my God, it's so full coverage. It's only for full coverage, full beat days. And I've heard the same thing about the Pat McGrath. And I think that like, I get what people are saying. I do think it can be diffused out, but I am in general agreeing that the intensity of coverage does feel more of like a full glam kind of situation. And I don't reach for her as much because I do feel like I have to be, first of all, it can get cakey for me personally sometimes, and I just have to be more careful about how much I apply. But I really enjoy having this in my collection, and I think that in general, I will keep this around or replace her when need be. I think as like a general higher coverage one. Although the Dior might knock this one, like I might not need this, but I do like having it. It's kind of like a comfort of like, okay, I have something that can really take me there if I want to. Now, last and maybe least is the Rose Inc Concealer. I wouldn't say this is least, but I would say that I was enthralled by the hype and I have not loved it as much long term. This is absolutely the thickest concealer that I own. It's also the most high coverage. So like, I'm not even going to swipe this because I feel like it's a waste of product doing that. This is incredibly like high coverage, and it just is one of those like a little goes a long way. Like, do you see? I just keep, and this is like, this could be a great thing, but the problem that I have had as I've had this longer is that I don't find it as user friendly because so little goes a long way. And it's an incredibly like dewy and emollient formula, which I find that if you go too far with it, it will just make my skin look cakey. I know I said that about the Pat McGrath. It's a different kind of cakey, but it's just like a too thick kind of cakey. And I have found that it can oftentimes interact with my other base products, whether it's any of my glowy primers or things like that, because it's so emollient. And obviously this color doesn't work with the rose ink and the e.l.f. and the ColourPop and maybe the Pat. I have to mix in the blue or the mint color corrector to turn these more peachy tones into something that works for my skin. So, that's a thing. But I just think that there is something about walking the line between high coverage and ease that like this ends up missing the mark for me. And the like thickness and the whippedness and the like all of it, that was one of the things that really drew me in and intrigued me about this product. But in the end, it just doesn't help the functionality of it. It's a good example of like, I needed to experience this end of just how emollient or how high coverage it could be to understand what I really like. And even on my hand, it doesn't give me the good skin glowiness of like the NYX Serum concealer. So it's interesting in that like it feels very emollient. And the thing is that it feels heavy on my skin. Even when I really try to use a light hand, there's something about this that just in the end, it tends to feel heavier on my skin. And so I just don't get that joy of reaching for it the way I hoped I would. I think this is my revamped kind of ranking from thinnest to thickest once I have gone through everything with y'all. Let me swatch them out for you, just 'cause. So there we go. That's all of them. This might be the most concealers I've had in my collection at one time ever, but as I kind of touched on over the course of the video, almost all of them have like a very useful place in my collection. And I have no regrets with anything that I owned, except maybe one. But I already talked about it a lot in the video. Yeah, and the money's already spent, so it's not really a regret, but like, whatever. The hype on that one kind of got me fucked up. I hope you enjoyed the video. Definitely let me know if you have any questions about anything I talked about. If there's something else you would like to see me nerd out over, you can also leave that in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you enjoy this makeup nerd adventure that I am on, and thank you so much for being here. Thank you again to my Patreon and my channel members, and don't forget to take care of yourself a little better today than you did yesterday, or tomorrow than you did today. You get the drill. Bye, friends.